Today, we're diving into the trickster mind and how we can actually navigate our deepest psychological paradoxes. It's a fascinating and frankly completely maddening reality about being human. We really like to think that we're these perfectly rational creatures, right? We assume that if we apply direct effort toward a goal, we're definitely going to achieve it. But the human mind is a total trickster. More often than you think, our direct, conscious efforts actually yield the exact opposite of what we really want. I want you to think about your own life for just a second here. Have you ever been lying in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, trying absolutely desperately to force yourself to fall asleep, only to feel your heart rate spike and your eyes peel even wider? Or what about this? Have you ever sat in a room with your friends or coworkers and just nodded along, agreeing to a plan that you privately hated, simply because you thought everyone else wanted to do it? Well, if you said yes, congratulations, you've fallen into one of the mind's hidden traps. Let's start things off by setting the scene with our first character. We're going to call them the maximizer. Picture them standing right in the middle of a massive supermarket aisle, just staring at an absolutely endless wall of toothpaste. Or maybe they're sitting on their couch, furiously swiping through a dating app, just swiping, swiping, swiping. You see, they live in this era of unprecedented modern abundance. They literally have the freedom to choose exactly what they want. Yet, instead of feeling liberated by that, they're terrified of making the wrong decision. They are completely paralyzed by the crushing weight of their own freedom. So it begs a really important question. Why does having this massive explosion of options actually lead to such intense decision fatigue? Why does our deeply cherished freedom of choice somehow become detrimental to our psychological well-being, leaving us with this severe fear of missing out, or FOMO, and making us feel completely trapped? Well, the answer lies in a scientific phenomenon popularized by psychologist Barry Schwartz. It's called the paradox of choice. Schwartz's research reveals this hidden threshold in human cognition. Up to a certain point, sure, adding options increases our freedom and our happiness, but once we cross that invisible threshold, choice suddenly becomes a massive burden. The more options we have, the more cognitive effort it takes to weigh them all. We become totally obsessed with finding the absolute maximum utility, the absolute perfect choice, which just leads to anxiety and ultimately total decision paralysis. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. Consider the famous jam study conducted by researchers Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper. They set up this little tasting booth in a grocery store. When they offered an extensive, huge array of 24 jams, 60% of shoppers stopped to look, but get this, only 3% actually made a purchase. However, when they limited the display to just 6 jams, slightly fewer people stopped, but a whopping 30% bought a jar. Guys, that is literally 10 times more purchases. Plus, the people who chose from that smaller selection reported significantly higher satisfaction overall. Simply put, less is very often more. Okay, let's leave the supermarket and picture our next character. It's 3 a.m., they're tossing and turning in bed, just furiously commanding their brain to finally shut down. Go to sleep, stop thinking, just fall asleep right now. They are putting in a massive, exhausting amount of mental effort to force an outcome. Yet the harder they try, the more awake, alert, and intensely frustrated they become. It's just a completely exhausting mental loop. This incredibly frustrating experience was actually captured beautifully all the way back in 1863 by the author Fyodor Dostoevsky. He wrote, "Try to pose for yourself this task, not to think of a polar bear, and you will see that the cursed thing will come to mind every minute." That just perfectly captures our characters' futile struggle against their own thoughts. The very act of trying to actively banish a thought practically glues it straight to your consciousness. So we really have to ask, why? Why does commanding your brain to avoid a white bear, or say a pink elephant, practically guarantee that it's going to appear? Why does the deliberate act of suppressing a thought inadvertently make it rebound with even greater force? Okay, let's dive into this. This whole mental boomerang effect is known as ironic process theory, which was extensively studied by Harvard psychologist Daniel Wegner. Wegner discovered that our attempts at mental control don't just fail randomly. No, they fail because of the exact mechanics of how we try to control our minds in the first place. The effort to suppress actually creates the exact outcome we're desperately trying to avoid. Here's the internal cognitive tug-of-war happening inside our sleepless character's head. Wegner proposed a dual process model. First, you have the intentional operating process. This is the purposeful, conscious, high-energy part of your brain that's trying to distract you. It's saying, okay, think about the ocean, think about a black car, literally anything but the white bear. But simultaneously, you have the ironic monitoring process. This is a robotic, subconscious, automatic system that acts like a silent, persistent alarm. It constantly scans the brain to ask, hey, are we thinking about the white bear yet? When you're stressed, tired, or just under a heavy cognitive load, your conscious operating process runs out of energy. But that automatic monitor, it stays active, constantly bringing the unwanted thought right back to the very front of your mind. It is pretty wild how our own brains work against us. But what happens when we put a whole group of these trickster minds together? Let's drop in on our third cinematic vignette. Imagine a family sitting comfortably on a sweltering 104-degree Texas porch, just drinking lemonade. Out of nowhere, the father-in-law suggests a 50-mile drive through the dust and heat to get dinner in a town called Abilene. The husband secretly hates the idea, but he says, sure, sounds good to me, assuming his wife wants to go. The wife absolutely hates the idea, but agrees just to keep the peace. The mother-in-law agrees, well, because she thinks everyone else is super excited. So they all pack into a boiling hot car for a miserable road trip. Predictably, the trip is an absolute disaster. When they get back, they realize the absurd truth. Literally not a single one of them actually wanted to go. Why on earth did they all agree to a terrible trip that directly contradicted the private preferences of every single person in the group? Have you ever been part of a team or a family that just sort of smiled and nodded, going along with a genuinely terrible idea just to avoid rocking the boat? Now, what's really interesting about this is the theory behind it. It was coined by management expert Jerry B. Harvey back in 1974. He called it the Abilene Paradox. Harvey realized that while we spend so much time worrying about how to manage conflict, mismanaged agreement is often way more dangerous. It's this collective fallacy where groups take actions that defeat their very own purposes simply because everyone is too afraid to voice their true feelings. The symptoms of this paradox are just fascinating. It starts with a false consensus driven by pluralistic ignorance, which is really just a fancy way of saying everyone is privately thinking, wow, this is a bad idea, but falsely believes I'm the only one who thinks that. This creates action anxiety. We're too anxious to actually speak up, so we just collude in our own misery. And unlike standard groupthink, which is this high-energy drive for cohesiveness where people actually do change their minds, the Abilene Paradox is very low energy. People privately know the idea is terrible the whole time, which leads to intense post-decision blame and frustration when the inevitable disaster finally happens. Which brings us to our final character. Meet the ultimate agony aunt. You definitely know someone exactly like this. They are the friend you call when your life is completely falling apart because they give absolutely flawless, objective, brilliant relationship advice. They see the dynamics perfectly. But if you look at their own love life, it is a complete mess. Just a series of disastrous, highly irrational choices. It's highly relatable, isn't it? Why are we remarkably capable of solving other people's problems, yet we utterly fail to apply that exact same wisdom to our own lives? Think about the blinding nature of being completely self-immersed in a problem. This specific cognitive bias is known as Solomon's paradox. It's actually named after the ancient King Solomon of Israel. Legend has it that he was renowned worldwide for his incredible wisdom and his ability to dole out incredibly fair justice to his subjects. Yet, when it came to his own personal life, he made terrible decisions that ultimately led to the demise of his entire kingdom. He had this incredible clarity for others, but total, utter blindness for himself. Psychological scientist Igor Grossman has heavily researched this asymmetry of wisdom. He noted that people reason more wisely about other people's social problems than about their own. You see, when we're giving advice to a friend, we naturally have psychological distance. We can see the big picture, recognize the limits of our knowledge, and weigh all these different perspectives. But when we're immersed in our own problems, our emotions and the immediate stakes totally hijack our reasoning. We completely lose that critical distance. Outsmarting your own brain. Actionable strategies to navigate your cognitive traps. Let's move on and see how this all builds together. We've seen how our trickster minds paralyze us with choice, torment us with suppressed thoughts, force us into terrible group decisions, and totally blind us to our own flaws. But knowing is only half the battle. Let's look at some actionable strategies to actually navigate these cognitive traps and start outsmarting your own brain. So, the absolutely crucial point here is that we can actually use these scientific findings to our advantage. First, to beat the paradox of choice, stop being a maximizer and become a satisficer. Set your criteria, and once you find an option that is good enough, take it and stop looking. Just stop. Second, to beat the ironic process, you have to stop suppressing. When the white bear pops into your head, acknowledge it, accept it gently, and just let it pass without actively fighting it. Third, to avoid that miserable trip to Abilene, be the one to disrupt the silent consensus. Ask the awkward question and voice your doubts. And finally, to overcome Solomon's paradox, practice distant self-talk. The next time you have a problem, ask yourself, what should your name do? Actually using your own name instead of I instantly creates that much-needed psychological distance. Our minds are incredibly complex, and sometimes, our instincts just lead us straight into these paradoxes. But by understanding the architecture of these cognitive and social inversions, we don't have to be held hostage by them anymore. So I want to leave you with this. The next time you find yourself stuck, overwhelmed, or quietly agreeing to a choice you secretly hate, take a step back. Ask yourself, which of these paradoxes will you catch first? Keep a close eye on your trickster mind. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.